While we're waiting to see if there'll be a few more, I'll take care of a few housekeeping things. I have some handouts from prior weeks, if anyone would like one and does not have one, that missed one earlier. I have some for weeks 1, 2, and 3. Also, Nicole wanted me to mention, since today's our last day, the class that will start next week, and this Allison Kelly is going to be here next week, and they're going to start a series of programs on Lenten, called Lenten Studies, and she's going to next week deal with the ones called Sabbath. So I think it's going to be very good, and encourage you all to attend that, if you will. I think that's maybe we should go ahead and get started. You know, we talked a few weeks ago about an Emily Dickinson poem that was called "There Is a Flower That Bees Prefer," and it went on to talk about the purple Democrat. She's talking about clover is what she's talking about, and that was a good poem. And so also putting together that purple was Emily Dickinson's favorite color. There are 55 Emily Dickinson poems that refer to the color purple. So with those thoughts in mind, I took Donna's trusty iron and made everybody a bookmark. And so I want to pass those around and everybody take a bookmark.
He's not your
And Beth will remember his.
Yeah, this is yeah, I like that.
So at any rate,
Thank you, Paul.
you're welcome.
You're adorable.
So, Kim, just hang on there a minute. Let me go ahead because I can. Hello, I can go ahead and open this with prayer. Dear God, you are our God of hope. We thank you for the image of something tiny with feathers perching in our soul, which represents hope for us, your children. Turn us away from insecurity and continually bend us toward the assurance that we, each and every one of us, are justified in our hope in the promise of your righteousness as shown to us by your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. I'm really happy that John Ryder is here this morning with us. And John has been, I think, since last Wednesday in the building and on staff. So many of you have already met him. But I'll try to finish on time today so that those of you who have not will have a chance to say hello to John. It's really great to have you, John. Thank you. This week I ran across something I wanted to mention to you all. We studied a poem a week or two ago, and the reason we read that poem was because it referred to Jesus as the tender pioneer, and we were using those examples of her poems in which she used Jesus as an example of a forerunner or a precursor of the journey that we will have to ultimately take upon death. And so I ran across something on Twitter by J.K. Rowling, the British author, the other day. She posted on Twitter, she said, and she had a picture of Boris Johnson, and he had his hair all disheveled, and he was like this. And evidently she doesn't like Boris Johnson because she said, all it said, her tweet was, "A great hope fell, you heard no noise, the ruin was within." So those are the three lines, the three opening lines of that poem that we read. And so you would have to know that or remember that poem to know what she was talking about. So, but evidently she is an Emily Dickinson fan. Someone will intersperse a couple of poems as we go along, and someone read the poem on hope. It's on the first page there. Anyone see it?
Down at the
Hope
bottom. Hope is the thing with feathers?
Yes, read it, honey.
Okay. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. and sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that would abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it ask a crumb, and never in extremity it ask a crumb of me.
That's a great poem, and I made a note here in my notes that the word hope with a little bird is one of the favorite things that tattoo parlors, the tattoo person is asked to do. There are thousands of them a year in the United States. A little bird with the word hope over it. So I want to jump to the significance of Emily Dickinson writing a letter to Thomas Higginson in Philadelphia when he had posted his request in the Atlantic for upcoming and artists that were starting out to step out and submit their work. And for some reason, as reclusive as she had already become by this time, she decided to respond to that and write him a letter. So her letter to Mr. Higginson, Thomas Higginson, remember he had been a Civil War general. He was now in Philadelphia. He was an author himself, but he evaluated other people's writings, and he was a literary expert and acknowledged as so. So she wrote him this letter, and she said, this was the letter. Are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive? The mind is so near itself it cannot see distinctly, and I have none to ask. Should you think that it breathed and had the leisure to tell me, I should feel quick gratitude. If I make a mistake that you dared to tell me, would you give me sincere honor toward you? I enclose my name asking you, if you please, sir, to tell me what is true. She said, that you would not betray me, it is needed to ask, since honor is its own palm. I love that, because she's saying, if you're an honorable person, I need not ask you to be honorable. But if you aren't honorable, it wouldn't do any good to ask you stuff. But you realize she wrote this letter to Higginson. She told him nothing in there. This is 5 lines. She didn't say anything about herself. She didn't say how old she was, nothing where and she didn't even sign the letter. So he's fumbling around in the letter, and he's a envelope about this big, sealed up, and he opens it up, and in pencil, tiny pencil, it says Emily Dickinson. So she was so shy that she didn't want to even put her name out there, except in this very secretive way. But at any rate, this started. She enclosed 4 poems. We've discussed at least one of them. Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers was that's one of her great poems, and we have discussed, or at least read it, had it in our notes. And another good one that I like is J318. I'll tell you how the sun rose, and if we get a chance, we'll have someone read that. Well, I'll just read it right now. I think it's really a good poem. I'll tell you how the sun rose, a ribbon at a time. The steeples swam in amethyst. The news like squirrels ran. The hills untied their bonnets. The bobolinks begun. Then I said softly to myself, that must have been the sun. But how he set, I know not. There seemed a purple stile that little yellow boys and girls were climbing all the while. Till when they reached the other side, a dominie in gray put gently up the evening bars and led the flock away. So that was one of the poems that she sent to Higginson. Well, remember that Higginson, he didn't like any of these poems. He particularly didn't like the punctuation, all these dashes and commas and capitalized words in the middle of a sentence and everything. He just thought the structure was horrible. He thought the content itself was not suitable to the times that people would be interested in it. But he was intrigued enough to write back to her and say, I received your poems, and would you send me some more poems? So this began this 23-year relationship of Higginson and Emily Dickinson by correspondence primarily. So in this correspondence, he would try to get information about her. He wanted to know more about her, but when he would ask her questions, she would get, like he would say, tell me about some of your companions. She would say, you ask of my companions, sir. My companions are the hills and the sundown. And I have a dog as large as myself that my father bought me. These are better than human beings because they know but do not tell. And her dog was named Carlo. She had this big Newfoundland. It was as big as she was, and it was named Carlo, and that was named after a dog that was in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And I think that dog was a pointer instead of a Newfoundland, but that's who Emily named her dog for. And the dog lived to be 17 years old and was her constant companion. She wrote a poem about her dog that is beautiful, and that you would think that that someone could not be this attached to a pet. But she said she's talking about grieving the death of her dog, and probably some of us have been there. She says, they say that time assuages. Time never did assuage. An actual suffering strengthens, and as sinews do with age. Time is the test of trouble, but not a remedy. If such it proved too there was no malady. So she's saying if you get over it, maybe it wasn't all that much to begin with, but you never really get over it. So, and Emily, she probably from the very start in her communication with Higginson was never really serious about paying much attention to him as far as any advice, so she was not careful in trying to answer his questions. She said one time, you asked how old I was. I made no verse but one until two, or one or two until this winter, sir. When I was a little girl, I had a friend who taught me immortality, but venturing too near himself, he never returned. I have had a terror since September that I can tell no one. And the sting, it's the sting, and I sing as the boy does by walking by the burying ground because I'm afraid. So that's the kind of responses she would give to him when he wanted to find out more about her. She would say, I would like to learn. Could you tell me how to grow? Or is it unconveyed like melody or witchcraft? Well, Higginson knew early on that I'm not a preceptor to this person that she claims that I am. She's not looking to me for any help, but I would like to keep up this communication and so forth. And so he told her one time, he said, every year I think that I will contrive somehow to go to Amherst and come to see you. And she said, I would be glad to see you, but I think would be an apparitional pleasure. Not to be fulfilled. But it happened 8 years after they started this letter writing back and forth between she and Higginson, and who was in Philadelphia. She agreed to meet with him on August the 16th, 1870. Emily would have been 40 years old. Higginson shows up at the homestead. She's 40 years old, and so he recounts this. He immediately recorded it and sent a letter to his wife and explained. He said, you won't believe what happened to me. And he's telling her about this meeting with Emily Dickinson. But then later on, after her death, and so he recounted it again. And he said, here's the way he described the meeting. He said, after a little delay, I heard an extremely faint and pattering footstep like that of a child in the hall, and it glided almost noiselessly. A plain, shy little person, the face without a single good feature, but with eyes, as she herself had said, like the sherry the guest leaves in the glass, and with smooth bands of reddish chestnut hair. She had a quaint and nun-like look, as if she might be a German canoness of some special religious order, whose prescribed garb was white piqué. With a blue net worsted shawl, she came toward me with 2 daylilies, which she put like in a childlike way into my hand, saying softly under her breath, these are my introduction. And adding also under her breath in childlike fashion, forgive me if I am frightened. I never see strangers, and I hardly know what to say. So that was his recounting of their meeting. She did go on though and sort of loosen up and start conversing with him, but she would say things what she termed as quaint things and aphoristic things, not really telling him much about herself. She would say, "Is it oblivion or absorption when things pass from our minds?" Or she'd say, "Truth is such a rare thing, it is delightful to tell it." How do people live without any thoughts, she would say. Or what he called the crowning extravaganza, she said, "If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold that no fire can ever warm me, I know that that is poetry." So that was the first encounter. He later on, he said, "I was never in the presence of anyone in my life that drained my nerve power as much as she did." He said, "Without touching her, she drew from me." And he told his wife, he said, "I'm glad that I don't live near her." Have you ever been around someone that just sucks the oxygen out of the room when you're around them? And evidently that's what happened in this case. He just wanted to get out of there, you know. So, but following on from Higginson, later became the person that, with Mabel Loomis Todd, that was responsible for publishing Emily's first poems in 1890. And Emily Dickinson had requested that when she died, that all of her personal effects be destroyed. All of her letters, all of her poems, all of her correspondence, all of her mementos. I don't think that this was very unusual in those days, that the personal effects of a person would be destroyed upon the dead. I don't think it was considered. But they didn't really realize, her sister and brother didn't realize what they would find in her room, remember? So they did destroy her letters. They destroyed hundreds of letters and correspondence and so forth, but they just could not bring themselves to destroy that little drawer full of these little fascicles of poems bound up so neatly. And there were over 800 poems there that they could not bring themselves to destroy. So then moving on to Lavinia Dickinson, Emily's sister, deciding to try to pursue having these poems published and enlisting the help of Mabel Loomis Todd, whom you remember was the neighbor that's husband was the head of the astronomy department at Amherst College. And Mabel Loomis Todd had an ongoing affair with Emily Dickinson's brother. So she would be around the homestead quite often in tryst with him. And so everybody knew her. She never really knew Emily because Emily would stay out of her way. She would let Emily play the piano for her, but she would never come into the same room. But she took on the job, she and Thomas Higginson, to do the publishing work on that end, and Mabel Loomis Todd would do the editing and the transcribing of these poems on the front end. And so the job of transcribing all of these hundreds and hundreds of poems from Emily Dickinson's handwriting, which Higginson had described that she must have learned her handwriting from the fossil bird tracks that were in the museum there at Amherst College from studying. It was just unintelligible. But Mabel Loomis Todd, she acquired a Hammond typewriter, which was the first typewriter that was ever invented that would type in caps. It would have an upper and a lower case because Emily had all these capitalizations. So the first effort to transcribe Emily Dickinson's poems into typewritten material was quite honest, to be as accurate as possible. But then to prepare those and edit them for publishing is where the rub came in. That's where they say, "Oh, gee, we shouldn't say this, or we should say that. This word would be more appropriate." If there was any reference made to a person, then they would probably take that name out. Because their idea, Mabel Loomis Todd and Thomas Higginson's idea is for her work to be accepted by the public and for it to be something we could sell books of her poetry, we need to, this idea of depicting her as this reclusive, spinster that was withdrawn and stayed in her room for 15 years and nobody saw her and she wouldn't venture out and maybe her shadow was seen. You can make her that mysterious person, not the person who actually had friends, many, many friends, right up until the day she died. She wrote letters on a daily basis to people. She baked for kids and she sent mementos and all to relatives. She was always, if someone died, she would be she would send condolences and so forth. But they wanted to depict her in a different way. So they had these 800 plus poems, but they didn't have one thing that was very important. Over the years, Emily Dickinson had sent to her sister-in-law, who lived next door, over 400 poems on their own, and their relationship is something that we need to talk about because it's a big part of Emily Dickinson's life. And I want to catch up to my notes here. I had a poem here that I'm not going to read now, but we need to move on now to talk about a little bit the relationship between Emily Dickinson and her sister-in-law who lived next door, Susan Dickinson. Because this is a relationship that lasted 47 years. These two were almost inseparable, especially in their early years. They were absolutely inseparable. The path from the houses was well worn. There came a time that when Mabel Loomis Todd and Higginson were trying to fold some of these poems in, that there were a lot of references in this portrait to Emily's writing to Susan Dickinson of her name would be in the poem, to Dear Sue and this, that. Now remember that most of the poems that Susan Dickinson would have sent, or letters, more letters than poems, most of the letters that she would have sent to Emily Dickinson would have been destroyed. The few that would survive would be the instance where Susan Dickinson would write a letter to Emily Dickinson. Emily would respond on the same piece of paper, right, and send it back to her. So that got preserved as a letter from Susan Dickinson. But the effort to cover up, if you will, and that's a good word for it, to cover up the relationship between Susan Dickinson and Emily Dickinson was started out with Mabel Loomis Todd and Higginson, but it continued on. And it was in the early 90s that two scholars, Dickinson scholars, Ellen Louise Hart, who's professor of English at the University of California, she's a longtime Dickinson scholar. She worked to establish the Dickinson Archives, which was an attempt to gather into one place at Harvard University as much of Dickinson letters and poems as possible. She sort of headed up the most comprehensive assembly of Dickinson's work. She joined in collaboration with Martha Nell Smith, who was professor of English at the University of Maryland. And there were, she had devoted decades herself and written several books on Emily Dickinson, and she is now president and director of the Emily Dickinson International Society. So they made an effort to legitimately delve into the relationship between Emily Dickinson and Susan Dickinson, her sister-in-law who lived next door, examine the correspondence, the letters that went between them and so forth, and lay it out for everyone and not try to erase the word Sue out of a poem as had been done many times before and tear off the top of a poem that may have been to Sue. And their study was so meticulous, and they had a lot of student help, that intern students would help them for months and months. And they would actually examine each little document. They would look for pinholes. If they had a pinhole in it, they would look at the pinhole under a microscope to see if it had rust around the pinhole. They were trying to determine, was this attached to something? Was this a letter that maybe had some flowers attached to it that Emily sent over to Susan and so forth? So in 1998, they came up with this book. says, open me carefully, which is something that Emily had said to Susan with a little memento she sent over one day. It says, open me carefully. So this book is a great book. It has a lot of the original Emily Dickinson letters that in here that were examined and went into this book. It says this book presents a selection from the extensive body of correspondence, inviting a dramatic new understanding of Emily Dickinson's life, creative process, and portrait. These intimate letters and poems tell the story of a passionate and sustained attachment between Dickinson and the beloved friend who was her central source of inspiration, love, and intellectual and poetic discourse. So these two authors, they put effort into this book to publish some of these letters from Emily Dickinson to Susan Dickinson and memorialize them. And it's really a good read, but the letters are so long. Emily, she would write Susan Dickinson a letter that would just run on 18, 20 pages. And it would not be all about their relationship or how much they cared for each other, that kind of thing. They would go down the line of everybody in the family with how are they doing and what are they doing, my dad said last week. My dad finally got me those books that he promised to get me. Now he's afraid that I'm going to read them. She fussed at her dad to get her certain books, but he didn't want her to read those books. On one long letter that's in here that she sent to Susan Dickinson. Oh, and Susan Dickinson, when she was 21 years old, she was a very accomplished person. She could teach most any course. She could teach anything from literature to math and to physics. And she took a job as a teacher in Baltimore. And so she was away for a year in Baltimore at a girls' school teaching. So a lot of the letters would have happened during that year that Susan Dickinson was away. But they would write to each other also when they were next door to each other. But one note that's in here that was written upside down after about an 18-page letter, Emily says, Susie, what shall I do? There isn't room enough, not half enough to hold what I was going to say. Won't you tell the man that makes sheets of paper that I haven't the slightest respect for him? So she's saying they just don't make pieces of paper big enough. So these letters are quite revealing of the relationship. I'll give just a couple of extracts. She said in one letter, Emily says, if this life holds not another meeting for us, remember also, Susie, that it had no parting more. Wherever that hour finds us, for which we have hoped for so long, we shall not be separated. Neither death nor the grave can part us, so that we only love. And she said, I don't know, she said, when you come home, darling, I shan't have your letters, shall I? But I shall have yourself, which is more. If you were here, and oh, that you were here, my Susie, we need not talk at all. Our eyes would whisper for us, and your hand fast in mine, we would not ask for language. She would, as I say, the whole letter would not be a particularly like that, but this was a consistent theme of how much she missed. And she would send these little notes, and I'll read a couple of them because they're neat. She said, who loves you most and loves you best and thinks of you when others rest? 'Tis Emily. She said, I could not, and some of them would be more serious, I could not drink it, Sue, till you had tasted first, though cooler than the water was, the thoughtfulness of thirst. That is a carryover of the theme, or it's the same theme that she has in some of her poems of success. You remember the poem, Success is counted sweetest by those who never succeed. Emily's theme that the anticipation of something is always greater than the actualization of it. So that was the theme there. And she said, in another little note, she says, to own a Susan of my own is of itself a bliss. Whatever realm I forfeit, Lord, continue me in this. And she said, my maker, let me be enamored most of thee, but nearer this I more should miss. And then she said, I must wait a few days before seeing you. You are too momentous. There was a poem that I would like for somebody to read, and it's J14, if someone would read that. Because it is a beautiful poem. It's I think one of Emily's best. Would someone read that? Mary Beth? Yeah.
One sister have I in our house, and one a hedge away. There's only one recorded, but both belong to me. One came the road that I came, and wore my last year's gown. The other, as a bird her nest, builded our hearts among. She did not sing as we did. It was a different tune. Herself to her a music, as bumblebee of June. Today is far from childhood, but up and down the hills I held her hand the tighter, which shortened all the miles, and stilled her hum the years among, deceives the butterfly. Still in her eye the violets fly, moldered this many May. I spilt the dew, but took the morn. I chose the single star from out the wide night's numbers, Sue forevermore.
That's a great poem. It's sort of the one that we've already had is I have a bird in spring, which is Johnson's number 5. But I really love this poem, in particular the last stanza. She said, I spelt the dew, but took the morn. I chose this single star from out the wide night's number, Sue forevermore. In other words, of all the array of billions of stars, I chose this single star, Sue forevermore. So she wrote some beautiful poems to Susan, and so not to spend a lot more time on this subject, but what was this relationship? 47-year relationship. Susan Dickinson went on in her adulthood. She was married, of course, although her husband was having an affair with someone else, but she had 3 children. She was very prominent in the Amherst community. She was the person in Amherst that if there was a fundraiser for a family of a Union soldier that had been killed and he had children or something, she would be the person that they would go to arrange this. She was one of the leading citizens. So it may be safe to say that the relationship that Susan was reciprocal in this relationship, but that she had sort of a life also. She had a lot of other things going on, and Emily more possibly than Emily, especially later on. But it was Susan Dickinson that prepared Emily and combed her hair for her coffin. And so it lasted right up until the very last day. And I have a little quote here somewhere. But in Richard Sewell's biography of Emily, which was in 1974, he just gave it a short thing in this voluminous biography. He said, they sat together in school, they walked together after school, they told each other their manifold secrets, they wrote long and impassioned letters to each other in the evening. In a word, they were in love with each other. And that's all he said about it.
What was that last line? Could you say the last line again?
Say the last line
again.
Of what I just said?
Yeah.
Yes. I'll read the whole thing. They sat together in school. They walked together after school. They told each other their manifold secrets. They wrote long and impassioned letters to each other in the evening. In a word, they were in love with each other. And so that was Sewell's comment. The authors of this book, when they went on their book tours and after 1998, and publicizing this book, they would be asked, well, what's this real relationship? Oh, well, and everybody was, I guess, looking for the lesbian word. They wanted it to be either said or not said. And I thought their response was consistent, and although it was sort of an academic response, I thought it was very appropriate. And what Martha Nell Smith would always say is, their passionate relationship throughout adulthood until Emily's death resist paradigms for standardizing emotional alliances. Although their relationship has strong elements of romantic friendship and mutual mentoring, their dynamic devotion to each other does not fit comfortably into any standard category. Lovers or sister or mentor or best friend or neighbor or companion, but it has the elements of all of these. So I thought that was a good answer. She's saying I think she said it would belittle this relationship to give it a label. It was so much of so many things. And so moving on now to Emily's declining health in the last year or so of her life. She was diagnosed with Bright's disease, which I think is kidney related. Dr. Eichmann would know. But most people think that she actually died of some sort of heart failure that brought on by a persistent high blood pressure that she had. She died on May 15th, 1886, around 6 p.m. And her brother Austin had recorded in his diary, because evidently there was some whistles that would go off in Amherst at 6 o'clock every day. And so he said in his diary, she ceased to breathe that terrible breathing just before the whistles sounded for 6. So he timed the time of her death by the fact that it was just before the whistles went off. Emily had very specific requests for what was to take place at her funeral and how it would be handled. Her coffin was white, a little white coffin. The lining of the casket was white. The handles were white. It had a white ribbon across it, and she was dressed, of course, in white. The service was, the family pastor there at the Congregationalist Church was Reverend Jonathan Jenkins. He was there. He led a prayer. There were some dignitaries there from Amherst College, because the family had been associated with Amherst College. But Emily was not a famous person, so there was no huge throng there by any means. But Thomas Higginson was there, and one of the things that Emily had requested at her funeral was that Emily Bronte's song, a poem would be written that I have in there. And I would like someone to read that if they will, because it's a beautiful poem. It's would be.
It's at the bottom of page 2.
Yeah. It starts at the bottom of page 2 of the very first page. Anyone see it?
What's the number?
Well, I'll just read it. This is the poem that Emily requested to be read at her
I'll read
funeral.
it for you.
Pardon?
I'll read it.
Yes, do.
Says no, it's got a parentheses around in the Grante's name. It's at the top on page 2. No coward soul is mine, no trembler in the world's storm troubles fear. I see heaven's glory shine, and faith shines equal arming me from fear. O God, within my breast, almighty, ever-present deity, light that in me hast rest, as I undying life have power in thee. Vain are the thousand creeds that move men's hearts, unutterably vain, worthless as withers weeds, or idleness fraught amid the boundless main. Wake and doubt is one, holding so fast by thy infinity, so surely anchored on the steadfast rock of immortality. With wide embracing love, thy spirit animates eternal years, pervades and broods above, changes, sustains, dissolves, creates, and rears. Through earth and moon were gone, and suns and universe ceased to be, and thou wert left alone. Every existence would exist in thee. There is no room for death, nor atom that its might could render void, since thou art being and breath, and what thou art may never be destroyed.
That poem, if you look at it carefully, it really has a lot of the themes that we have talked about in the last few weeks that were consistent in Emily Dickinson's poetry. This idea of the survival of a part of our mind, which she labels as the soul, and the transportation of this into eternity. Emily had sent over when she was very, very sick, she had sent over a tiny little note to Susan Dickinson, and that also revealed some of this. It was just penciled, and she said, you must let me go first, Sue, because I live in the sea always now, and I know the road. Remember, she used the sea as a metaphor for the journey after death. It was always, you're at sea, and when in this afterlife transition. And so here again, she's using the example of what she thought Jesus was to us, is the forerunner and precursor of something that we all will eventually go through. And so she's mentioning that same thing in this. Higginson said later, he said, Emily's face was a wondrous, he was looking into the casket, and he was talking about Emily's face was a wondrous restoration of youth. She was 54, she was really 55, and she looked 30. Not a gray hair nor wrinkle, and perfect peace on the one beautiful brow. There was a little bunch of violets at the neck and one pink cypripedium that the sister Benny had put in along with 2 heliotropes by her hand. So her specifications didn't end there. She had requested that the honorary pallbearers, who were mostly officials, the president of Amherst College and others like that, that they would only carry her coffin just out the door of the homestead, the family house, and once they crossed this threshold, there were 6 men who had worked on the farm there, Emily Dickinson estate, or her father's farm. There were 6 men who worked for the family that picked up the casket, and they took a route that Emily Dickinson had prescribed. And according to her instructions, the party, they went out with her casket, they walked around, it circled her flower garden, and it walked through a barn behind the house, and then it meandered across Buttercup Fields, and it walked this way all the way over to the West Cemetery. And so when she was buried there was a simple gravestone that just said EED on it and a date for a long, long time. But her niece, Martha Bianchi, who would be Susan's daughter, this was a family plot. It's still there right now. It has a little iron fence around it. It's probably about the family plot's about the size of this room, I would think. The headstone was replaced by Martha Bianchi later, and before Emily died, when she was very bad off sick, and she communicated with her little cousins, the little Holland boy and girl, and she communicated with them often, and she had sent them one of her little pencil notes, and it had 2 words on it, called back, and Emily, it just called back Emily. That's how sick she was and forecasting her own death. So when Martha Bianchi had this gravestone replaced, and it had one put in that actually says Emily Dickinson across it rather than EED, and it's stands right next to her sister Benny, and they're just alike. that's what it says on it today. If you went there today, it says Emily Dickinson gives the date of her birth, the date of her death, and it has 2 words that says called back across the bottom. So, so sort of wind up, I think that Emily Dickinson knew from the get-go that she was a great poet. I don't think she ever was really asking to find out anything. I don't think she ever intended to take any advice from anyone other than perhaps Susan Dickinson once in a while. But she knew that fame and being famous as a poet and all doesn't come to those who seek it and look for it. And so she knew she could not write to please others or to conform to standards to seek fame. She sent a little note to Higginson one time. She said, to earn it by disdaining it is fame's consummate feat. He loves what spurns him. Look behind, he is pursuing thee. Talking about fame, you know. And so in that obituary, and I hope you all, if you have time, will read the Susan Dickinson's writing of the obituary of Emily Dickinson, and maybe read it in the new light of discussion we've had today. But one of the things that she says in there that was so true of Emily Dickinson said she lived her life in the light of her own fire, and I think that's good. And so the closing words on her obituary is the stanza from the poem that Emily wrote. It says, morns like this we parted, noons like this she rose, fluttering first, then firmer to her fair repose. So I really thank you all. Very good. Thank you. I really